6 months after Pearl Harbor, Japan still looked unstoppable. Its carriers had struck hard, its armies were advancing, its navy seemed faster, sharper, and more dangerous than anything the United States could put in the field. To many observers in early 1942, the balance of power in the Pacific looked obvious. Japan had the momentum, America had the damage. But in June 1942, that balance began to shift. Not in a vast clash of battleships, not in a long, grinding siege, but in a few violent minutes over a patch of ocean near a small atoll called Midway. There, a battle fought mostly by aircraft would break Japan's carrier strength, stun its navy, and change the course of the Pacific War. This is the story of how Midway turned shock into resistance, and resistance into reversal. To understand Midway, you have to begin with what came before it. Pearl Harbor had not ended the war, it had opened a new phase of it. In the months that followed, Japan expanded rapidly across the Pacific and Southeast Asia. The Imperial Japanese Navy was operating with confidence. Its carrier force had become the sharp edge of a growing empire. Japanese planners wanted more than another victory. They wanted control. They wanted to force the United States into a position from which recovery would become harder, slower, and more uncertain. Midway became central to that plan. The idea was both aggressive and clever. Threaten Midway, draw the remaining American carriers into battle, destroy them, then secure another outer defensive ring in the Pacific. If the plan worked, Japan would strengthen its strategic position and leave the United States even weaker than it had been after Pearl Harbor. But the plan carried one hidden weakness. It depended on secrecy. And by the time the Japanese moved toward Midway, that secrecy was already breaking apart. One of the most important weapons at Midway was not a bomb, a torpedo, or a carrier deck. It was intelligence. American cryptanalysts had begun breaking parts of the Japanese naval code. They knew the Japanese were planning an operation against a location identified only as AF. The question was simple. What was AF? The answer could decide where the United States would risk its remaining carriers. At Station Hypo in Hawaii, American codebreakers developed a test. Midway was instructed to send an uncoded message reporting that its water distilling system had failed and that the island was short of fresh water. Soon afterward, the Japanese transmitted that AF was short of water. That was the confirmation. AF was Midway. With that knowledge, Admiral Chester Nimitz could do something rare in war. Prepare a trap for an enemy that still believed it held the element of surprise. The Japanese thought they were setting the terms of battle. In reality, the Americans were already waiting. Nimitz did not have the luxury of overwhelming force. He had urgency, he had partial intelligence, and he had just enough strength to gamble. The American carriers Enterprise and Hornet were available. Yorktown had been badly damaged at the Battle of the Coral Sea, and Japanese planners believed it had been lost. But American repair crews worked with astonishing speed. What was expected to take months was compressed into days. Yorktown returned to sea in time to join the battle. That mattered, because Midway would not be won by weight of numbers. It would be won by timing, positioning, and the ability to strike first at exactly the right moment. Nimitz placed his carriers northeast of Midway and waited. The Japanese still believed they were moving toward an enemy that had not yet found them. In reality, both sides were already moving toward one of the most decisive naval encounters of the war. On the morning of June 4, 1942, the battle truly began. Before sunrise, the Japanese launched aircraft to strike Midway itself. Their goal was to suppress the island, damage its defenses, and prepare the way for the larger operation. The attackers found Midway, and Midway found them. American aircraft rose to meet the incoming strike. The defense was brave but costly. The Japanese still managed to hit the island hard. Yet even as bombs fell on Midway, the larger danger to Japan was not the atoll below. It was the American carriers waiting beyond the horizon. That was the tension at the center of Midway. The Japanese were attacking one target while another, far more dangerous one, was about to reveal itself. The battle was no longer just about the island. It was becoming a contest over who would locate, strike, and cripple the other carrier force first. The first American attacks did not look like victory. They looked like sacrifice. American torpedo squadrons went in low, slow, and horribly exposed. They faced fierce anti-aircraft fire and aggressive Japanese fighter cover. Many were shot down before they could score meaningful hits. The losses were terrible. From the cockpit, Midway did not look like a masterpiece of coordination. It looked like confusion, smoke, tracer fire, and men flying into almost impossible odds. And yet those attacks mattered. They forced Japanese combat air patrols down to low altitude. They pulled defending fighters away from higher levels. They disrupted timing. They added pressure. They kept the Japanese decks under stress as aircraft were being recovered, rearmed, and repositioned. What seemed in the moment like failure was helping create the conditions for something far more decisive. The sky above the Japanese carriers was becoming crowded, chaotic, and dangerous. And in war, chaos is often the doorway through which catastrophe enters. Then came the moment Midway is remembered for. At roughly 10:20 in the morning, American dive bombers arrived above the Japanese carriers. For the Japanese, it was the worst possible moment. Fighters were low, decks were busy, aircraft, fuel, and munitions were in vulnerable positions. The fleet was under stress and in transition. And then the dive bombers came down. Within minutes, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu were hit. Flames spread, smoke climbed. The balance of the battle changed with shocking speed. What Japan had built so carefully, the striking force that had helped deliver Pearl Harbor, was suddenly breaking apart in front of the world. This was not just tactical damage. It was a rupture in Japan's offensive power. In roughly 5 minutes, the battle changed, and with it, the Pacific War began to change as well. There are moments in history when preparation, courage, luck, and timing collide. Midway had just produced one of them. But Midway was not over. One Japanese carrier, Hiryu, had survived the initial disaster. From that surviving deck came Japan's answer. Hiryu launched counterattacks against the American carrier Yorktown. The first strike damaged her badly. Later attacks hit again. For a time, the Japanese believed they had found and destroyed more than one American carrier. The battle remained confused, violent, and far from settled. Yorktown became the American symbol of endurance at Midway. She had already returned from major damage faster than anyone expected. Now she was absorbing the punishment of a battle that refused to end cleanly. Smoke rose from her decks. Crews fought fire and flooding. Men struggled to keep the ship alive. Midway's great turning point had already happened. But turning points do not erase danger. They only create the chance to survive it. And for both sides, survival still had to be earned. The Japanese still had one remaining chance. As long as Hiryu could launch aircraft, Japan still had a carrier capable of fighting back. That is why finding her mattered so much. American search aircraft eventually located the carrier. Then U.S. dive bombers struck. Hiryu was hit, set ablaze, and effectively removed from the battle. Now the pattern was clear. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu. The heart of Japan's carrier striking force had been wrecked. This was the true scale of Midway. The United States had not merely damaged an enemy fleet, it had broken the offensive core of the most dangerous naval force Japan possessed. For a nation that had entered 1942 with momentum, confidence, and carrier superiority, the shock was immense. Midway was no longer just a battle. It was becoming a strategic disaster for Japan. But victory at Midway was not clean, easy, or cheap. Yorktown, battered by air attack, did not survive the aftermath. As salvage efforts continued, the Japanese submarine I-168 reached the scene. Torpedoes struck. The destroyer Hammond was lost. Yorktown, after all it had endured, finally slipped beneath the sea on June 7th. That matters because Midway was not a story of invulnerability. It was a story of risk. American aviators had taken severe losses. American ships had been damaged and sunk. Men had gone into the water and never come back. The difference was not that the United States escaped suffering. The difference was that the suffering produced a strategic result Japan could not replace. Carriers can be built, pilots can be trained, but not instantly, and not without time. At Midway, time itself began to shift from Japan to the United States. So why did Midway matter so much? Because this battle was bigger than a single day's exchange of bombs. Japan lost 4 carriers. It lost aircraft, it lost highly trained crews and aviators, and it lost something even harder to measure: momentum. Before Midway, Japan had the initiative. It was expanding, choosing the pace of operations and forcing others to react. After Midway, that confidence was broken. The United States was still fighting a long war. Nothing about Midway made victory immediate, but it changed the direction of travel. Instead of trying merely to survive, the United States could now begin shaping the next phase of the conflict. That is why Midway is so often called a turning point. Not because the war ended there, but because the strategic balance started to move there. Pearl Harbor had shown how vulnerable the United States could be. Midway showed how dangerous the United States could become. So how did Midway change the Pacific War? It did not end the fighting. It did not erase American losses, and it did not make Japan weak overnight. What it did was break a pattern. It stopped the sense that Japan could strike, expand, and dominate without decisive interruption. It proved that intelligence mattered, that preparation mattered, that timing mattered, and that even a force that looked unstoppable could be caught at the wrong moment and broken by it. Pearl Harbor had been the great shock. Midway was the answer. It was the moment when the United States began turning survival into strategy and strategy into momentum. In the Pacific, wars were fought across vast distances with long horizons and slow movements. But sometimes, history still turns in minutes. At Midway, it did. And when it turned, the Pacific War turned with it.